talking about depth and complexity.
All right, so this is going to be a brief talk. It's just on depth and complexity, which are very important. They're very important attributes for games about decision making, right? Yeah, exactly. Now, examining your game through these lenses, it can make your game easier to understand and it can make your game harder to solve, right? Both of which are key for games that, again, revolve around decision making. But not every game does this. If you're making a game like Super Hexagon, this talk really doesn't matter and you should just sort of zone out for like a couple of minutes, right? Now, complexity I define complexity here as the amount of knowledge a player needs to make a decision, right? Basically, you can look at the amount of data and the number of rules present at that point, right? Now, complexity changes with player experience. This is actually a very key point because your players' decisions change over the course of the game, right? What they're trying to do and what they're thinking about changes as you go through your game experience. So keeping track of where players need to know what is very critical. And keeping track of the deltas in this complexity is also very critical. Right? A game with good onboarding can get away with much more overall complexity than one with poor one. And this is why. Right? Now, where this becomes really interesting is in games like chess and Go. Right now, everybody always looks at chess and Go as examples of games with very low complexity. Because when you think about them, they have very few rules and they have very few pieces, right? So while it's true that to go from not knowing anything about the game to being able to make legal moves is very easy, the complexity with this delta is very low.
Sorry, quick question. What's a heuristic?
Just a general definition, it's a way you calculate a value. So in this case for complexity, one heuristic would be the amount of data that you need to know. Basically, you have places which require you to assign a value to an arbitrary concept, right? Like complexity, right? A heuristic is a mental framework you use to generate that value. Right, rules of thumb is a very good word. So while it's very easy to get to being able to make legal moves in chess and Go, being able to play well is very difficult, right? And that's because it has a lot of analytical complexity, where you know that other people are playing better than you, but you don't really know why they're playing better. You haven't developed this way of thinking, right? And of course, analytical complexity is much more satisfying than memorization, right? But it's still complexity, and when you're making your game, you should consider this when looking at your player's full experience, right? Now, depth is the ability of players to make better decisions. If a player feels that he or she can make no better decisions, the game has no further depth for that player, right? Of course, this is very dependent on your player. If a player can make better decisions but doesn't know that the player can make better decisions, it's as though the game is solved for that player, right? Once again, this definition is very individual and it's very binary. Either a game has depth or it doesn't. So a good way to look at this for more use for you when you're designing your game is how many players still feel that the game has depth in it. How many players feel that the game is solved, right? And a way to look at that is how long does it take your players to feel that your game is solved? Because if your players are only going to solve your game after your game finishes anyway, it really doesn't matter, right? Now, what a lot of people do when they're trying to solve for a lack of depth is add more pieces to the game, which adds complexity, right? And examining complexity as a function to generate depth is also interesting, where if a player loses to a rule or to a piece that he did not know before, then the game still has depth for the player, because the player can now become better at the game by keeping track of this rule or piece, right? So, while this game has more depth, and not only is there more depth, but this is a depth that anyone can approach, right? Like everyone can remember another piece or another rule. So that's the plus side. The flip side, though, is that players will often feel it's cheap to lose to something they didn't know about, right? And that's really about it for the talk. I think everybody has a feel of these concepts, but defining them and laying down rules of thumb.
Do you feel like, This is very mathematical, so I'm coming at you now outside of math. How much of this relates to fun?
So the thing about fun is that it's a very subjective term that means a lot of things to a lot of people. So this is one layer deep. The first question you need to ask yourself is, when I'm building this game, do I expect people to have fun out of the decision making in the game, right? Not all games expect that. If I'm playing Super Hexagon, or even if I'm playing Mario, the fun of that game is not really in the decision making. If I'm playing top level Hearthstone, or Magic, or chess, right, the fun is in the decision making. Does that make sense to you?
So Mario,
How do you feel about games that mechanical controls to add that? This is a great example with fighting game Street Fighter.
Yeah.
It is all decision making.
Yeah.
But you have to have the physical ability to pull off that before you can do it. So would the game be better if you could do those special moves instead of pushing the button?
This isn't a value judgment on games, you know? Like, this is just, I think that this exercise is useful for a game like Street Fighter when you're looking at the decision making, but I think that the physical aspect is a wholly different thing. One of the great things about the physical parts of Street Fighter is what I like to think of as free throws, where when you're playing basketball and you're shooting free throws, that's something you can get better at, right? Like, the free throw line's not going to change, the basket's not going to change. And in the same way, the mechanical complexity of Street Fighter gives you an entry point into the game, where I don't understand the whole Yomi layer, and I don't understand like why that move is great and why this other move isn't great. But I can just get better at executing combos.
So is that like low complexity means that you can start playing sooner?
Exactly.
And low and high depth means you can play for longer.
Yes, that's a quote.
that's
But
Blizzard, right?
huh?
Low complexity, high depth. That's kind of Blizzard's design philosophy.
I think that there are a lot of people who hold that philosophy.
Yeah.
I think if you look at any game,
Like StarCraft.
it's all relative, right? Like, you only define low complexity in relation to other games. So if you look at Heroes when compared to League, it's low complexity. When you look at Heroes when compared to Go, like just getting into the game, it's high complexity, right? Because I can explain Go to you in 2 sentences.
Yeah.
No, so it's all relative.
Yeah, I think this was a great example of where your entry barriers to figure out the game is very low.
Yeah.
Name it any game. Hearthstone's an example where when Hearthstone came out, a lot of MTG players, Magic players panned and said, this is MTG for babies. But then the point is, once you get in the game, the amount of depth you have is actually brilliant. And then that's how you see a lot of people from Magic actually migrating Hearthstone, because that's when they discovered it.
But then what's interesting is that their free-to-play model starts to interfere with the depth of the site.
You want?
No, so we can have a discussion on this afterwards. So let him finish,
Yeah, sure.
and then you can go talk to him about it, which is awesome. This is exactly what the talks are for.
Hi. Thank you.
All right.
Something in the needs of shoutcasting. So I'm a shoutcaster myself, so if you need some training as well, you can drop by. It's all completely free of charge. You can come in and I will train.